You know, they say honesty is the best policy. There are a lot of different reasons for people to take classes online. Hey guys. And I get it. It's an option that we offer, and it's a convenience for a lot of people. But I would also encourage people, to try to check it out in person. It's a little something extra. We get participatory, we have questions, and it's a good thing. And I'm laughing because I've been wondering for a while if we would get more people, less people, or no change on this day. Because, look how it fell. It wasn't by plan. Your reading assignment brought you forward to cultural Marxism with the suggestion that it was occurring in America. And that was the reading leading up to an election we had yesterday, where we had a president-elect announced today. And the person who did not win had been charged with being a Marxist. Her father was actually a practicing Marxist economic professor. Again, none of that was actually decided when this study was decided. All that broke, that big change in the Democrat Party nomination process, like immediately afterwards, which I knew was going to potentially have an impact, but I wasn't going to change something that I felt that was God-led over something that was political. With that being the case, there are many people in our country that feel relieved today because they see one side of the political groupings as being guilty of what we just read in this book. They see that the civil rights movement was basically co-opted and corrupted, that it went beyond civil rights into something else. And that something else that you read, structurally from the author's point of view, looked like things of communism, right? Where instead of walking away from the civil rights movement in unity, instead we had this new worldview being promulgated throughout our country in media, culture, education, etc., where we were looking at people in very divided ways, where it was not only acceptable, but encouraged, and in some cases seemingly required at threat of punishment if you didn't immediately quantify and qualify an individual person instead as being a group, right? Had to be in a group. And when you're doing that, when you're putting everyone into groups, by definition, it's divisive. Because think about it, whether you think it's good or bad is not currently the point. But if the moment I meet any human being, I have to divvy them, sort them, divide them into a group, it is inherently divisive. It is also inherently judgmental. No, it really is, right? No, we're not talking good or bad right now. We're just talking like logic for a minute, okay? It's like, look at Barack Obama. Is he black or white? Well, he says he's black. And we say he's the first black president, okay? I mean, I took a genetic test. I was adopted. I didn't really know my background, right? I may have more like quote unquote Hispanic blood in me than President Obama has of African blood in him. I don't know. But why do we think in such ways? You see? I mean, it used to be prior to this co-opting that our authors purport, that folks that thought that way were the bad guys, right? They were like the Ku Klux Klan guys who were always like, what percentages of your blood is this and what percentage is that? And we're going to label you this and we're going to label you that. But we were supposed to be getting away from all that. And instead, somehow, it turned into de facto government policy, and then it turned into government policy, And then it turned into a cultural norm. And then it turned into cultural pressure. I saw small accounts of racism, small, no violence, injuries, small, both in the Northeast, very quote unquote minor, and in the Deep South. Not quite as minor, but nothing like the movies or something, you know what I mean? But I'll tell you the truth, where I saw the worst ongoing, pressure-packed, life-changing, leave you crying in your room all night racism was at LSU. And it was by black people on other black people. People in my family had the exact same experience, whether it was an undergrad, law school, or whatever, where we had firsthand experiences of people who were very good friends and had been best friends forever and were roommates and were study partners, and finally had to announce with weeping and gnashing of teeth and groaning and crying, like, I can't be that with you anymore. Because like the people in my black fraternity or my group of friends here in law school, they will not accept that. I'm going to be ostracized and cut out. That's just real, right? Absolute real, absolute truth. Go ahead, Paul.
Who is originally from Germany, and she works over here on a green card, and she was shocked at all our local, state, and federal forums that have a block where you have to choose race. She said that's illegal over there, following Hitler's Germany.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So we have young children, and for about a year or so, because of a strange confluence of events, we moved to a very expensive neighborhood in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Chapel Hill is viewed as the most liberal place in the state in every way, politically, socially, religiously, theologically, has been forever, right? Even when North Carolina was seen as like a buckle in the Bible Belt, Chapel Hill was seen as a very liberal and a little more secular and all that. Extremely high percentages of PhDs, master's degrees. Here's the reason I'm telling you all this. So we move into this expensive neighborhood, and we have young children. And one day, I happened to go to the furthest back of the property. There had been like a buffer, between the properties that backed up, just like little tiny pine trees and stuff like that. You couldn't see the next place or anything. And a kid had kicked a ball or something in there, so I'm getting up in there and getting almost all the way to the back. And I run into this lady who also has her young child and is kind of to the back of the property. It's the first time we'd ever seen each other, so we were chatting. She is extremely highly educated. She is a department head at Duke, both teaching and through the university as well as the Duke Hospital. I don't want to get any more specific than that to identify the person. But we're chatting, and I don't even know how in the world it came up. Quite frankly, in light of what we were just talking about, certain folks from a certain point of view just inherently wanting to talk about these matters, inherently wanting to see through these lenses, I feel it's a fairly high probability that she brought it up, but I honestly can't remember. I have no idea why I would. But we ended up somehow talking about raising children in the sense of like a worldview, including in like race relations, right? And without hesitation, it was in your book, by the way, it's very, very famous. I had been studying Martin Luther King, took several specialized classes in this with a very renowned academic scholar for writing MLK books. And so I made some references to quote some things from MLK, and told her I thought that it lined up with biblical things as a Christian. Went on to talk about how, that we homeschool our kids, which she wasn't overly in love with, I could tell that. And that really got her going, asking questions, frankly, from a sort of negative perspective. And it was like, how do your kids get this and that, and how do they get properly exposed to this and that, and how do they get properly socialized to this and that? And I'm answering her questions. She was obviously coming from a very deliberate point of view, but she wasn't being, biting or anything like that about it. And so we got to a point where I said, well, for homeschoolers, socialization is a challenge. And I said, but there are ways to deal with that. You just have to be intentional, right, with what your kids do. I said, and we ultimately did. I told her our plan. So our kids played football, and they played baseball, and they did dance, and they did art, and they did music, and okay, whatever. She's completely, unimpressed by any of this. And then I figure out where she's gone. It's about race. And she goes, oh, but in all those settings, do you really think there's going to be any diversity in the people that they interact with? And I said, well, that remains to be seen. I said, if you think about kids playing baseball and football and all these other things, like I think there would be various degrees of diversity of different types. And I said, but I got to tell you, this is the key for you guys. I said, I really like that whole content of the character thing and not judging by the skin. And I said, socialization at very young ages may not be all that it's cracked up to be. Because we can be exposed to like ungodly things when we're very young that can be hurtful and even in our thinking processes. And I said, my children play this game. And it's this game where there are little like flaps that come up and down, and there are pictures of people, and you have to guess like the people based on their description, right? And so the people have different skin tones, eye colors, glasses, no glasses, hat, whatever. And it finally struck me one day watching these kids, they were making absolutely no racial distinctions at all. None. Never once did anybody use any racially distinct word. And this was a commonly played game among the young. We have 4 kids, the young kids in our house. It would be like the shorter man, the slimmer man, the man with glasses. No one ever made a racial thing at all. And I thought, that's beautiful. Like, I like that. You know what I mean? So I'm sharing this with this woman, and she got the most horrific look on her face. And now she did give me the snarl. She's like, do you really think that's good? Do you really think that's healthy? Shouldn't they be getting raised with like this awareness of the differentiation with the races? Then she just popped with all of her Maoist, cultural, Marxist stuff. And I'm like, ooh. That was the first I had ever encountered someone who was woke. It was a long time ago. And who was it? A rich white female at the highest levels of academic achievement. Interesting. That profile, like, okay, what was the itch you were looking to scratch there? Clearly not your background. And then like the next question is, where did it come from? Cultural revolution. It came from what you read about in the book. Do you follow me? The other thing that I thought was interesting, I've felt this way from a Christian perspective in a lot of different areas. But the authors make a comment about how they fought the man and then became the man. You realize this is very common, right? Whether we look at what the communists do in general or what these quote unquote cultural Marxists did, don't miss this, in corrupting, it's what evil always does. Evil corrupts the good. Do you follow? It's also extremely effective because, as I heard a famous pastor say one time, half-truth is what the father of lies says to us. Because it's so deceptive, to point to a little truth and try to get you to not look at the part that's not true. So if you take something that is inherently good, but you take it too far, or you twist it, or you corrupt it, you get the half-truth thing going, on top of everything else. You get deception, you get destruction, you get corruption, which is pretty much the description Jesus gives in the Gospel of John of evil. We talked about it way back at the beginning. These folks said that they were about equality and all, but with very little pause at all, there were those that didn't seem like they really wanted equality. Jesus says, judge by the fruit. We don't have to get inside people's heads, make all sorts of assumptions, try to get government FBI reports and all that mess that was going on back then from all these different people, and try to tear down civil rights leaders for all their wrongs and everything else. It's just not necessary, because Jesus says you judge by the fruit. And look at the fruit where we are now. I mean, you have Asian kids who are literally technically minority, if you think in all these numeric ways of the population and whatever, who have to fight, like a decades-long battle in the courts because they're being discriminated against to get into college. What? How'd that happen? And all of a sudden you start thinking, well, maybe it's not so much about what we were told it was, because there was a corruption. Maybe it wasn't about racial minorities. Well, maybe it was the communist Maoist thing all along. Well, why? Well, then all of a sudden here in the last few years, something new happened. The Jewish students started getting discriminated against, they felt like. And it's like, hold on, what's up with that? And pretty soon, it looked like even where there had seemingly been sort of accepted norms, as inappropriate as they may have been, that developed that were seemingly about racial issues, it ultimately ended up here at the end, meaning like peak wokeism over the last year or two. It ultimately seemed to be really the communist worldview model. Have and have-nots. Have and have-nots. You get it? That seems to be the big differentiator at the end.
Lyndon Johnson told you what it was all about in one of his private meetings in the White House. I won't necessarily repeat the quote here, but it was very clear it was about power and voting.
Yeah.
And so that's what the Democrats, aka communists, wanted. And thankfully, in my opinion, people are woken up in the last 50 years, and that is being countered against.
Yeah, one of the things that's complicated as somebody who worked at this stuff, including at a presidential level, everybody who's a registered Democrat's not a communist, right? And everyone who is a registered Republican isn't necessarily pro-Constitution or pro-freedom or even pro-free market. And that's one of the things that makes it very difficult for the electorate, right? It's another way, I believe, that the communist influence in America has caused us harm that the book has not yet been written on. Because there's an infiltration in both parties, right? And there's a corruption. And so what happens is the people can't ever quite get a clear bead on like which party's for us and which party's going to help us, because there are significant subversive elements within both parties that fight against the things that sometimes they spend generations saying that they're for. This is not secondhand knowledge. I've seen it. I worked both sides. Louisiana was one of the only places that for a period of time it was mildly acceptable that you could work both sides of the fence. It's a long story why. It has to do with our unique political background and our open primary system. So I spent 95% with Republicans, but sometimes for some very, very powerful, very wealthy, influential Democrats. So I've seen both sides, in the back rooms, as they say. Yeah, the influence is strong. But let me give you like this point as an example. It's in here. One side of my adopted family was from Appalachia. Some of you have heard this story, but most, especially the 100 at home, have not. They were poor, and they were coal miners, and they were like, to use the schema you mentioned, they were Democrats in registration to the core. They could not. It was like bred into them. They could not vote for anyone who was not a Democrat. It had a lot to do with, feeling that the mine bosses were Republicans and that they savaged them as like somewhere between indentured servants and slaves. And the union was the only group that had any power that helped them, and they were Democrat. And the union basically said the only way that these guys just aren't going to keep grinding you up like raw meat is you got to vote for Democrats. They'll get some government protections for you, and they'll help us have power to fight, the Republicans, that own the mills or the mines or whichever town you may have lived in Appalachia or getting down into the Carolinas. And they weren't wrong, right? But long after all that started shifting in our political system and getting very complicated as to who was what and all, the government came in and the folks were poor. You do understand, right, that folks in those mines weren't paid with money. They weren't paid with money. They were paid with script, which I still have some of. And that it was a debt cycle. You bought everything from the company store. Your housing was provided on this like rent, lend, lease sort of basis. You were always in debt, and the company controlled everything. So it was like Hunger Games or something, right? It was like debtor's prison. They wouldn't let you move. Do you get it? You couldn't quit your job. You couldn't move because you were instantly put in debt. You were a quasi-slave, even though you were as white as a ghost as far as your genetic background and your skin pigmentation, right? But carrying forward. They were one of the first groups that were targeted to get help by the government, right? And I remember my dad lost his job for a short period of time, and it was under the terrible economic policies of people who frankly happened to be Democrats, right? Remember that period when we had runaway inflation, all that crazy stuff, and everything that transpired from that? And he was proud, and he lived a little too high on his means. No matter how much money he made, he seemed to overspend it. So losing the job wasn't something that was planned. He was too proud to call his family. And so things got tight there for a short period before he kind of got things back in line. And it was tight for a lot of people. And so I had learned just from kids in school and looking around that there were like these government programs, you know what I mean? People were talking about dad got, unemployment insurance, or like mom's got food stamps, or whatever. So I kind of got around the edges that things were getting tight, like to put food on the table. And I mentioned this to my mom, but my dad overheard it. And he wasn't cruel about it, but he was very strong and resolute. And he's like, we will starve before we get on any government program. And one of the grand ironies is I learned from deep, deep blue Democrats in the family and the extended family, the classic euphemism, which is, the most dangerous words in the English language. I'm from the government and I'm here to help you. Because they found that people may or may not have been well-meaning, but they had no concept of the unintended consequences of what they were doing. And they saw it as highly destructive in their communities. You get this idea, and by the way, it was dredged back up a few weeks ago with Helena, which made me want to puke, because people got this idea that they pumped up of these crazy old hicks out in the mountains, and they're going to hunt us down and kill us. It's like deliverance. They're going to come get the government man because of like Donald Trump or something. No, it had nothing to do with Donald Trump or anybody else running for office. There is an inherent generational stamp among people in that area that the government may not have your best interest even if they say they do, and that they might accidentally hurt you or get you killed. And so when people saw evidences of that, because the government is sometimes not all that efficient, that like went home to mama. It had nothing to do with whoever was running for president. That's a generational thing, like a scar. Okay. whether you think that some of these policies that were corrupted were intended for good, which for some people who were idealistic, they probably were, whether you thought it was just gross incompetence, which for other people, bureaucratically, was probably true, or whether you think it was nefarious, and there were definitely people who were caught on record who knew that it would destroy people in certain cultural and community ways. Jesus says, judge by the fruit. It just is what it is. It happened. We're on the other end of it, right? There are things in this book, and I don't normally cite the books that much, but there are a couple of occasions, once or twice sometime in these studies, where I'll do what I'm doing now, that just really resonated with me. Another one was the comment about how middle-class neighborhoods in the cities were wiped out, both white and black. I got one more story for you. Remember I told you I liked MLK, I liked to study MLK and read about MLK. I had a professor who was quite renowned as an academic scholar for MLK, for academic books and writings. And he had an extremely close relationship with the King family. Some of you have heard this, again, most have not. Because of his extremely close relationship, they actually gave him an enormous amount, I don't know if it was all, but he had an enormous amount of their personal family mementos and items. I mean, like a U-Haul, small U-Haul truck full of boxes full of the King family, not copies, but real, authentic items. You know, picture books, albums, notes, all kinds of stuff. Well, it turns out, I'm in the master's program at Duke, it's getting to the end there, and this professor's got retirement coming down. So he asked all of us, like as a favor / maybe he'll cut us some slack on some extra credit, right? To come in some evenings and help sort through all this, label it, get it all back in order, because he feels like it's his obligation to get it back to the King family. So we do. So I have gone through boxes and boxes and boxes of original notes, mementos, photo albums, etc., from Martin Luther King and his family. And I had no angle in any way. I was just doing it to help out a professor, and I thought it was interesting. That was kind of a secondary point. But here you go. Toward the end, I noticed something, and it was when I was going through a bunch of photos that were loose and needed to be put together. There were these pictures that I didn't have any like contemporary place to put them in my mind. They were from MLK's family, and they were showing like people in his family, his dad, relatives, friends, social gatherings, just regular old photos like from back in the day. But it was just clearly in like what we would consider an upper middle class, largely African American neighborhood. And it was great. It was Americana, right? I mean, there are people here, everybody's dressed well, they've all gone to church. It was mothers and fathers together, children together. You know, you could see like small businesses, accountants, whatever. It just classic kind of upper middle class Americana in a neighborhood there in the city. And I thought, where did it go? Do you get it? Where did it go? Our authors were not wrong when they said, as a result of some of these highly divisive policies and violence that ensued and all that places like this disappeared. They were either literally destroyed, literally burned out, or because of the impact of violence and other things, they just disappeared, right? I mean, I saw this beautiful thing, and it's like, where is that? I mean, I thought you guys won, right? Excuse me. You were wanting equality. You wanted all these things passed. I'm glad you got them passed. So I would have thought that what I saw in these pictures would have like thrived. Instead, I'm like, I've never seen anything quite like this. This is amazing, but sad. Where is it? Okay, one more for you, just for fun, because it's literally in your book. And I don't know if you got taught this. I didn't. They're right about this in the book. I don't know how many of you got taught about the violence that came up through this time period. Because, the Marxist revolutionaries are always violent. And the book is asserting that the Marxist revolutionary, the cultural revolutionaries, the Maoist type people corrupted the civil rights movement, right? So it's almost like we can't really be told about the violence. It has to be like, shh. So I didn't know. So I'm 17, going on 18. We're driving around, and as an 18-year-old, I ultimately end up with a job situation trying to make money for college in Detroit, working. And being young guys with no money, the most we could do for fun was just like drive around and look at this place. Most of us weren't city people anyway. Really, none of us were. And just like I was shocked by that photo at Duke from the King family, we went down into certain areas in Detroit. This would have been like 87, give or take, right? And I thought I had suddenly like been transported to some end times, movie or something. I expected Mad Max to come out. I mean, the city was dead. There were large areas of places that were burnt out. The streets, the buildings, the bottom layers were either open or had broken plywood, and I'm like, I don't understand. I couldn't fathom it. You understand? I mean, we're in America, and I couldn't understand how is this possible? Was there some like unbelievable natural disaster or something that happened like a year or two ago, and somehow I missed it? No, you know what it is now, right? It was referenced in the book. There was such extreme violence and burning and looting and all the rest. It drove so many people out that no one wanted to come back and take a chance on rebuilding anymore. So, if there were like middle and upper middle class African American neighborhoods like around that city core, they probably couldn't be sustained anymore because the city core was gone. We've been conditioned to think that everybody that left the city core was racist. Yeah, maybe not so much, right? Maybe not so much. A lot of people left those immediate areas. It also was highly disruptive in African American communities at a neighborhood level. The book only mentioned it in passing. But, you even know this in New Orleans. There are moves, to this very day in certain downtown areas where people want to attempt, and I'm sorry, it's gone. I mean, God help you if you want to try, but, use your own money. You want to steal it from everybody else to try to do it because it doesn't look like it's going to happen. It's just too long. A lot of people have come to the realization, like, the government came in and told us they were going to do all this stuff, and it destroyed us. Like, we had these thriving networks, interconnected networks of neighborhoods, and they were just destroyed through all sorts of different government actions. All sorts of different government actions. What do you end up with? Well, you end up with the outcome of what Marxists want. It was in your book. The Marxists want to replace, remember, this goes back to orientation, guys. God tells us the fruitful foundation for civilization is a family unit. And families interconnected generationally, frankly, and we don't do a great job of that currently in America right now, right? And that was the norm for human civilization, like forever. But all these government programs and actions and the rest just blew that all to pieces. And where communities had been able to help each other and sustain each other, and they were often around faith communities, right? Instead, they were blown apart. Segregated, separated, everybody moved away from everybody. Those connections were literally destroyed. And then on top of that, the overlay was right at the moment when like birth control and everything else was coming to say, go out there and have all sorts of wild relations that have nothing to do with connecting and building families and having kids and all that. Instead, government programs came in, and it's to this day like this, by the way, to varying degrees, and discouraged like a nuclear bomb, division at the most personal of levels. Because it's like, my family blew apart. I'm living with Mama. She says I shouldn't live like this with all these guys taking advantage of me. I thought somebody was doing this and somebody used that, but I got pregnant. But that's okay because somebody told me that I could get off on my own. I don't have to listen to mama jawing in my ear because I can get assistance from the government. And that word got around. And just for the record, online or otherwise, about how it's not black or white, to come full circle with you, back in Appalachia, visiting with my great-grandmother, she's a 100-year-old, very Christian person, a couple of years before she died, do the math on that one, sitting on the front porch. Remember, I doubt to my knowledge, she never pulled a lever that said R on it. But she's a Christian, and she can see, even though she was legally blind. She could see. And she's telling me about how these government programs had destroyed all the people, and she's naming them off, all up and down that long, winding road, right? About how just everything I said to you, right? How all these government programs were encouraging people not to work. They were encouraging people to become drug addicts. They were encouraging people to live like dogs with, not knowing who their fathers were, all this crazy stuff, and it was complete obliteration. So for generations, the folks there along that road, around the beginnings of the mountains and all, they lived fine. Humble, but fine. And now she looked at it and saw it like a social hellscape. Again, all lily white. The impact there was the same thing on those lily white people as the impact was in the inner city on the darker skinned people. It wasn't about skin tone, right? And we have to accept that some of it was eventually, no doubt, done on purpose, because at some point it wasn't just one or two nefarious people. After a while, you can see it. If my grandmother sitting on her porch, who was legally blind with degeneration or whatever they call it, ocular, she's 100 years old, she could see it. You think folks in the government and politicians couldn't see it? Oh, they could see it. I mean, they had generations to see it, but there were political motivations behind it. Because again, the communist position is to break you down personally, to break you down from the traditional structures that would bind us together and make us strong. Instead, the communist position is to make us weak, divided, and ultimately reliant on government as if God. And don't miss this last thing. Back when those communities were all together and very, very healthy, those black communities, they were largely sort of in orbit around churches. And it's funny because if you go back from that point into the past, historically, a lot of them voted for a certain party. But after the churches were crushed and the communities were crushed and the families were crushed, then suddenly there was a great flipping and those communities voted for a different party. It's funny. It's an interesting coincidence how all that worked out. To this very day, you can see similar things. Just being honest with you. I mean, look, we're flooded with it. We just had an election, right? Everybody's running around out there on news media and social media and everywhere else trying to give their debriefing. And you'll hear it, right? I mean, if your profile is that you're married with 3 kids and you go to church, then you're assumed to vote in a high probability of a certain way. And if your profile is you're not married and or you don't have kids and or you look for a government check to sustain you every month, you vote a different way. And on page 151, you were told about Cloward and Piven, and you can do more research on that. But this isn't conspiracy theory. As was pointed out in your book, a lot of these folks went into academia. And you know what they do in academia? They write academic papers. And then they want to get to be a PhD, and they have to publish it to be a PhD. You have to get published, at least technically. And so it's all out there. You can go to Amazon, you know what I mean? You can go find papers and books and treatises and whatever that literally lay out all this wild Marxist, Maoist, cultural revolutionary stuff. This is not just me bloviating or a bunch of wackos out there that get bad labels on them on the internet or social media. You can go pull the books and buy them. I have stacks of them at my house that I've read. See, this is why I told you all from orientation that I believe it was appropriate for our authors to not simply use the word communist. And while I personally prefer anti-human, and we already hashed that out before, I get why they use a broader term like unhuman. Because all this stuff we're talking about, if you got it in history at all, if you picked up on it in some reference on the History Channel, God knows how slanted that is, at all, you'd never hear the word communist. You might hear 15 other words, but you'd never hear communist. But through a different lens that we're trying to look through, you might see them now as just parading by different names, right? Parading around by different names. Any comments, input, or questions? It would be impossible for me to start without a handout, which I thought I'd put on here, but no. Can I borrow one? One of you guys got a handout you want to share? Anybody want a handout? You share with me? That's okay. Thanks, guys. Last call. Go ahead.
Not to beleaguer it, but what you've said about your grandmother, talking about the particular area, we had firsthand experience with that with our youngest daughter. It was very interesting how Jennifer was encouraged to stay in a welfare system. She wound up quitting school. She got pregnant at a very young age, and we helped out for the longest time. And Jennifer made her decision to leave on her own because she was smart enough to know that if she kept staying with us, she would never make it on her own. Years later, she's a great mom, great girl, wonderful. But this was back in 1992, and she moved to Baltimore, and got on the welfare system, and it was very, very interesting to watch what you said. You have to see it firsthand. What she lived, the area she lived in, what she lived in, she made it the best that she could. When she wanted to go to school or get a job, even a job, she was discouraged and told, no, if you want your welfare check or your care, you cannot do these things. Literally, it was.
It's a dehumanizing culture.
Well, that's a way to keep you down and keep you dependent.
That's the part that people will want to fight over.
But
it's I'm from the government, I'm here to help you, but I'll destroy you if you're not careful.
You should have seen what happened to those areas. Since then, she was smart enough after a while. She was young, just like a lot of our young people today, buy into the system, get into the system, and then realize, oh my God, I'm a slave. And then interesting how she got herself out, along with several other of her friends, black and white. And but you have to see Baltimore to understand what that is. When you were talking about your Appalachia areas, places in Baltimore are absolutely rat holes.
You know this already, I think. The other side of my family is from Baltimore. So, born right outside of Baltimore, hung out in Baltimore growing up. I've driven through there. And my kid told me he flew into Baltimore for a cheap airfare. And I'm like, oh, we got to talk. Go ahead.
I love Baltimore.
It's
a city that can be a hometown. There are places in Baltimore you don't want to go. It's worse, but it's very interesting because the black community knows that they have been held down, and they're coming out from under in a lot of ways.
There is definitely some of that. Go ahead, Barbara.
I found it interesting in the book, with all of that they're saying about what the government has done, he never really calls out the legal system.
No.
And that kind of surprised me because so much of the corruption has happened within the legal system.
He mentions it in passing, right? When we think, Paul, over here was another one, unless you had another. He mentions it in passing. You know, when we think of lawfare, it's a highly charged political term because of things that have gone on in the presidential election and whatnot. But in the readings that we had assigned coming up to this part, he mentioned lawfare once or twice in a little bit broader sense, kind of along the lines of what but he just didn't go down that path in great depth, would be my answer to that. Go ahead.
Quick Google search for the federal programs that have the word social in them. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, CHIP program, SNAP program, WIC program, SSI program, TANF program, Section 8 housing, low income energy assistance program. That's just a quick few.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's always that thing, right, where evil corrupts the good. I think most Americans are at a point today, for better or worse, where we think that, a safety net is a good thing. Well, why is that? The families are largely blown apart and scattered, so the whole, grandma and 3 cousins are going to help me out. Safety net is largely gone. The churches have been completely corrupted and blown apart, so what we used to think of as churches as being a safety net, that's largely gone. And so what you're ending up with is, well, the safety net of last resort is the government, right? Because the family and the church has been dramatically changed over the last couple of generations. Go ahead. But even there, again, there's the corruption, right? Where the safety net, as they say, becomes a hammock, and it starts to destroy people instead of helping them.
Well, just 2 quick points. One, I was introduced to, it didn't start with an S. I learned a new term for somebody that say, well, I'm not going to really produce whatever because I'm a minimalist. And I went, what? Minimalist, like, I'm a minimalist. I'm not worried about doing all these things.
Yeah.
And then another one was that my father-in-law was a funny, very smart, very good with his hands individual that had, he was he served in the Korean War, right? And he was, what do you call, I'm trying to say, a veteran, disabled veteran in discharge. And because of that check that he got for disability, he could have been he could have had a shop, he was great with his hands, loved as a mechanic, but I can't make over this amount of money because I'm going to lose and so therefore he didn't, I really think he could have had a successful business, but
Yeah.
he handcuffed himself for a minimalist check.
If you turn to the second page at the bottom, my intention was to build up to these discussions because we had to finish off sort of the broad discussions about revolution and all. But in light of the election and everything else, we went ahead and jumped into them. But like what Barbara brought up, there were a few allusions made to some of the legal and or illegal justice and injustice issues related to this topic. And so again, going back to some of our very first gatherings, I gave you a little synopsis in the sense of one verse out of Leviticus 19. Do not pervert justice, do not show partiality to the poor or favoritism to the great, but judge your neighbor fairly. I think that and several other scriptures that are similar really blow apart the sort of cultural Marxism, DEI, wokeism, just blows it apart biblically. And shows you, that a lot of things that are called social justice, as you might expect at this point in our course, are the opposite. They're injustice. The things that we're told are fair are often unfair. The things that we're told are justice are often unjust and or unjust. And to me, I see the hand of Satan in it. In the book, they said, in essence, that, at what should have been the crescendo moment for American healing, the passage of all these various and sundry laws, rules, regulations, and certain applications administratively, bureaucratically, and legally. Well, it's like, okay, well, we're done with all that. We got to move beyond all that. We need a truly fair system. right at that moment, the corruption occurred. And it turned into, they fought the man, they became the man, right? As far as the application of power. And I'll be blunt with you just because I'm really big in the truth, even though not everybody will share the same perspectives. We're all unique individuals. That was a little before my lifetime, just a little. But in my lifetime, I felt the same way about when Barack Obama was elected, right? I didn't vote for him. But I thought that from a certain point of view, that had the potential to be like the final. Like if we missed it back in the 60s, right, then maybe here's our second bite at the apple as a country to kind of move past any lingering, inherent bitterness and divisiveness because, we elected the first black president, okay? And instead I felt it went in the opposite direction. And just like we talked about the corruption of policies in the 60s, I felt that, frankly, Barack Obama personally did the same thing. I felt that he flamed a lot of division by his personal actions, very personal stuff. It was not even about policy at that point, per se.
I find it funny on your perspective because I had the opposite perspective when he was running. I saw right through his cloak. He and his wife had, as you described, papers, that they would do in school, completely blocked off. So I knew immediately that he was a Marxist at minimum, communist at maximum, and that his whole goal in life was to separate and stoke racial division for more power. And that's exactly what he did.
No, I'm with you. I saw that. Like I said, I didn't vote for him. One of the photos I saved back on my old laptop back then, it used to be everywhere. Now it's hard to find, was that iconic until they made it go away. And you're going to know why they made it go away in just a moment. There was for a time during that campaign, this iconic photo of him with his sleeves all rolled up. And he's like, at the chalkboard, teaching and trying to make it look like he was an academic. He was an adjunct at Chicago School of Law. But a lot of people did what I did and others did, and you blew the picture up and you look at it, and he was actually like teaching this kind of stuff, right? He was teaching like, Saul Alinsky rules for radicals. He was teaching like Cloward and Piven. That was his thing. And I forget which one I think it was Saul Alinsky. It could have been Cloward and Piven, but I think it was Saul Alinsky that was lined out, diagrammed on the chalkboard behind him. And so once people figured that out, then that photo stopped being iconic because it would be a tell. Do you get it? So I was just trying to be hopefully optimistic, right? From a cultural perspective, I thought this might be another shot. But I would agree with you. I think he went back to his sort of very divisive roots. And it's like, are you saying because he's black? No, I already told you, I'm not sure his genetic makeup as a racial minority is as high as mine. Seriously. Right? I don't know. Maybe. It's kind of up for grabs. So what am I saying? He supposedly had, from his own book writing, some very sort of sketchy or unclear mentors who are thought to be Marxist. It's like, wow, that just keeps cropping up here. Like, what's up with that? Go ahead.
Going to say maybe some of us in this audience here today or tonight saw toward the end of this past election where Obama, since we're talking about Obama, how he was lecturing young black men about their obligation to vote along, racial lines, and really chastising these young men. And it came out again this morning. I just happened to catch a clip on it, and they interviewed some of these young men, and they were really offended by that. They said, how dare this man lecture me how I should think and vote because of race? And then they very objectively said, after all, isn't that racism?
Yeah, it's racism to the core. I just don't know how far I want to go with this with you guys. I worked for an African American female who had been a lifelong Democrat and a community organizer. And her mom was a lifelong Democrat and a very influential community organizer in an identified, well-known neighborhood. And she left. The Democrat Party became Republican. Nobody wanted to touch her because everything about her, the way she looked, the way she acted, she was a, community organizer. You know what I'm trying to say? So why did she become Republican? And she ran a protest election against a well-connected white guy who won in a minority district. What? Well, I'm going to tell you right now. Here's what happened. Because of her pedigree on the left, the community organizing, neo-Marxist sort of left, from relatively young ages as someone who was thought of as, not super influential because she's somebody's daughter and she's in the background, she had direct experiences of powerful African-American politicians getting drunk and whatever on election nights in their celebrations and saying things that shouldn't have been said, even though they thought it was a safe crowd. Because, see, she's very black. Like when you meet her, if you think about such things, if you ponder such things, you think like maybe she's straight from Africa. She's, you know what I'm trying to say? She has all the features, she's very black. She had taken note that a lot of these very, very prominent politicians had different features in a lighter skin tone. And one of the reasons she took note of it was not paying much attention to her because she was younger and sort of around the edges in the background. These guys started yakking in their drunken celebrations one election night about how they feel about black people. But they're publicly saying, I'm black. Do you get it? All right? And what they were doing was the same things that happen around the world, like in Africa and other places. People have ungodly, demonic hatreds that come up through all sorts of different things, right? And what these guys were talking about was the really, really dark black people, which was an overgeneralization because, they're drunk, that live in Section 8 housing projects, etc. They were referring to themselves as like the masters. They're the light-skinned black guys who identify very openly as black, of course. And they were referring to the other folks as their cows, that they corralled on election day and they milked them. And she was so unbelievably offended in hearing everyone drunkenly talking about this, that a woman who had been raised as a leftist community activist, multi-generational, left it all, had a big blow up, and registered as Republican and ran a protest election against a white connected guy who was part of that machine at distance, because, you get it. So I'm just telling you, that's, as they say, out of the horse's mouth, that, we get this illusion that it's all about like brotherhood and sisterhood and race. And it's like, yeah, but how much of it is power? Remember how we've said the whole premise of the book and the premise of this study was that communism in the end isn't really about an ism. It isn't about all the idealistic things we're told. It's just like from Satan. It's like a deceptive haze to give cover to people who are just terrible people, who want to take advantage, who want to gain power, who are willing to do violence in order to do it. And they just use the term communism as sort of like a cloak over their pure evil. She saw the pure evil. You know what I mean? She saw it that night and was like, I'm out.
If you really want to see true, well, I guess there's no true communism, but communism within the United States, if you go to an Indian reservation, that is probably the closest communist nation, even though that's against the Constitution, that you will find locally without going to Cuba or North Korea. And that is a hellscape. It is exactly what you described. You have a bunch of tribal elders that run the masses into the ground, and they have no work ethic, all because they're on the dole of the United States government.
And it's not because they're Native Americans. Because you know where we used to talk about like the drunken cultural destruction like we're talking about is so often, and God help us, prevalent among Native Americans, Indian reservations, whatever you want to call it. We used to say that when I was a kid about Russia. Now again, they're lily white, Slavic and all that, right? But they were like the drunken, Russians with the vodka. Again, you see the lies we've been told? It's not about so much cultural background even, necessarily. And it's certainly not about skin pigmentation or genetic test results. Leave that to the Nazis, the Fabian socialists, who kind of sparked all that, by the way, and the Cluckers, the Ku Klux Klan. I mean, it's communism, and its versions thereof, which I've been asserting to you, is sort of like Satan's thing, frankly. All right, because we have a whole 30 minutes, we're going to actually go ahead and flip the page back over. We had been working through some things going on in Kings related to this sort of rebellion and revolution. I picked back up, right where we were kind of rolling into with haste. Would somebody read our selection there at the top? It's not super short, but not overly difficult words. Barbara, thank you. Got her first, and I'll come back to you, Fred, for the next one if you're ready. Mm-hmm.
Also, Jeroboam, son of Nebat, rebelled against the king. He was one of Solomon's officials. The Lord said, I will not take the whole kingdom out of Solomon's hand. I've made him ruler all the days of his life for the sake of David, my servant, whom I chose and who obeyed my commands and decrees. I will take the kingdom from his son's hands and give you 10 tribes. I will give 1 tribe to his son so that David, my servant, may always have a lamp before me in Jerusalem, the city where I chose to put my name. Solomon tried to kill Jeroboam, but Jeroboam fled to Egypt, to Shishak the king, and stayed there until Solomon's death. Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel 40 years. Then he rested with his ancestors and was buried in the city of David his father. And Rehoboam his son succeeded him as king.
Okay. We were already moving into this last week. Some of it harks back to that, but you don't need anything more than what is right in front of you to answer this first question. There are spiritual reasons, factors, as well as temporal, rubber hits the road kind of factors for this revolution that's boiling here. Anybody want to give me an example of one? I'd like to get at least one example of each. Anybody got like a spiritual sort of factor, observation, what's going on here?
One of the spiritual observations is that Solomon worshiped other gods, and as a result, God separated the kingdom. And a temporal example would be high taxes.
Yeah, that was last
Expenses.
week, right? You're harking back as far as the taxation, but you're absolutely right. That's one of the issues here. Yes, spiritually, don't miss this. There's the question of God's providence, right? I have made him ruler, right? So notice the mix that you see here. It's probably going to be a sermon upcoming somewhere in the not too distant future, but there's a mix here always between God's providential authority and sovereignty and the gift of freedom that he gives us, right? Because on one hand, we're about to talk about some serious mistakes that were made because of the free will given to human leaders. Okay. But on the other hand, it starts off with God saying, look, I was making all this happen. I set this whole thing up, right? Like I got a plan for Israel. I'm the one that chose these kings that set them along this path. So you see, there's always that nexus, some would say a tension, it's not really tension, between, again, God's complete providential sovereign authority and the gift he gives of free will, right? So back on the free will side. So spiritually, We're told here God's sovereign. He's laid all this out. He picked David because he was willing to be obedient. Solomon sort of falls away from that obedience, gets corrupted. Anything else you see here? Well, one of the good answers for a temporal factor is the second question. How and why did Solomon respond to the situation? Don't miss it. Don't overthink it. It's like right there. It's like Don Corleone stuff, right? How did he reply or respond rather?
He put a hit out.
Yeah, he put a hit out, right?
On his son, yeah.
Just in case we were wondering if God wasn't right, because he always is, about how Solomon had sort of like fallen away from being godly in any way. Is in this moment, is Solomon sort of like, penitent before God, Lord, guide me, direct me, I'm so sorry. No, he just put a hit out on him, right? Very fleshly, very temporal. Bob?
I also think that Solomon knew that he wanted his lineage to continue. He had intentions of his son taking over, not 10 tribes.
Sure, yeah. And look, this is one of those occasions again where you could say, well, hold on, isn't this something you could say about like anyone who's a king, a pharaoh, some sort of tyrant, and some of their, human condition sort of things? Yes, of course. But once again, right? Look at communism. I mean, it's sort of their thing, right? I mean, if you just got a little bitty touch in the book about Russia, right? But if you just go take a peek at Wikipedia, which I don't particularly like, or as I have brought up several times, if you want to take a little time, go get yourself a free week of Paramount Plus and stream A Gentleman in Moscow. I'll warn you, there are things about A Gentleman in Moscow that are agitating because of cultural Marxism. You have to suspend disbelief and you have to buy into a bunch of Russian, leaders being black, which they were not. Because, it's expected that you have to cast people that way because of the woke cultural Marxism. You see where I'm going? So there are a few things that from just, I think, a logical point of view, you have to sort of hold your nose to. You don't hold your nose to black people. Actually, I thought the actors were really good, right? I thought they were fabulous. I've seen some actors who I thought were shoestrung in Disney, and I'm like, they're terrible actors. Like, where'd you pull them off the street? But I guess you had to have a certain demographic, profile. These actors are excellent. It's not their fault, right? They just got cast completely out of context because it's ridiculous, right? But if you look past that, you get a sort of granular, rubber hits the road personal story of the constant shifting intrigue. This person's going to be in charge and that person's going to be in charge, and we're angling for who else is going to be in charge, and violence and murder is always on the table. And it's like, hold on, man. What happened to that whole, it's all for the people, we're like all one and we're going to build this utopia? But in reality, that's not the way communism ever works out. It looks more like this kind of stuff. Divisions, power struggles, violence, death, all on the table, constantly there. Who's coming next? Who's going to get the next? It's just terrible. What could Solomon have done differently and for better? Again, don't overthink this. What could Solomon have done differently and for the better? Barbara, was that you? Repent and follow the Lord. Yeah, that's a home run question. I mean, a home run answer there, right?
He could have listened to his people and continued to lead and try to take care of their needs.
Yeah, you nailed it, right? And it's some of these same patterns that we read in the book in some different instances leading up to communist revolutions. The leader here was not responsive. He wasn't responsive. There were leaders that were not responsive, and they dug their own graves, quite literally in some cases, right? A lot of times, the book tells you that communists will call anyone against communism a fascist. The book will tell you that anyone who stands against communism is going to be called Hitler, a Nazi, or a fascist. But the great irony is that sort of application of power has been proven out to be as prevalent, if not more so, among quote-unquote international socialists, communists, as those terrible factors that get applied actually, historically correctly to fascists are to them, because they're flip side of the same coin. We're back to our orientation again, right? But don't miss this. One way that a leader could respond is simply to be responsive to the people. It's like a pressure release valve. It's actually what our American constitutional system is supposed to do for us when it's working. The other part is, what are we doing in here? Spiritual, right? I mean, even if Solomon didn't have a right sort of thinking about governmental policy and power, the executive, what we would call the executive branch and all that, if he had just been more open to God and been humbled by God and been listening to God. See, that's sort of where we're at now. Not everybody who might be on the right track with our country is going to be a Christian, right? Some could potentially just come to think better about the Constitution and freedom, and a lot of libertarian guys kind of fall in that area, they plot in different places on these topics and all. But for us, the way forward is spiritual, right? And we might not all agree on the specificities of political policies and position, but what we're believing is, if we're called to humble ourselves, to listen and obey, to allow God to be our Lord and our shepherd, then our country will be going in the right direction, period. And see, here it is again. Solomon could have learned, if you fast forward in history, things that we've read in this book about being more responsive. It was good politics. Or he could have just not turned his back on God, right?
But as well as that, if you look at Stalin in his young life and Lenin in his young life, and in Lenin's family, they had this ongoing rift with the Romanov family. And at any rate, I think that they used this concept of Marx and Engels, communism and socialism. I think they used it as a guise to, in my humble opinion, to satisfy their own just intrinsic evil nature.
Yeah, they have like a bloodlust.
Precisely, like a bloodlust.
I absolutely agree with that. Yeah. Again, as we've talked about sort of periodically, it kind of bubbles up here and there in some of our sessions. Are there those who are true believers, the useful idiots, as they've been referred to sometimes by communist leaders? Yes. Are there those who are utopians and they're just lack knowledge and they're being immature at best? Yes. Are there those that maybe are losing spiritual battles, like their minds are twisted, to be blunt? Romans chapter 1, yes. But you have some that are just evil. They're evil, and they have bloodlust, and they just use communism as a cover for that. Like Jeffrey Dahmer should have come out and said he was a utopian communist or something. I mean, I don't mean that seriously, but you get my point, right? Would someone read our next section of Scripture? 1 Kings 12, Israel in rebellion. Thank you.
Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had gone there to make him king. When Jeroboam, son of Nebat, heard this, he was still in Egypt, where he'd fled from King Solomon. He returned from Egypt. So they sent for Jeroboam, and he and the whole assembly of Israel went to Rehoboam and said to him, "Your father put a heavy yoke on us, but now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you." Rehoboam answered, "Go away for 3 days and then come back to me." So the people went away.
Okay, for those handful of you guys that are in Holy Land Discipleship, our intense Bible study on Thursday mornings, you get another question you're going to get just for you guys. How many days were they told to go away? 3. It's very interesting how often 3 days comes up in the Old Testament, dozens and dozens of times, as a seminal period for us as Christians. 3 days. For another day. For what did the people specifically ask? Lighter burden. They wanted a lighter yoke. Yoke is about control. Okay? It's about control. And so what do you get here? What were they seeking more of, just in general? It's a great American word. Freedom. Do you get it? They're generally like, can you get off our back, right? Can you not be so controlling, whether it's property, money, labor, whatever? Like, we want freedom, which is what we were scheduled to end up with tonight, right? Galatians 5 is for freedom that we've been set free. That has a lot of applications for us spiritually and temporally, because the two are interconnected, right? They just wanted freedom. I'd like to suggest to you that's all people really are ever looking for. God made us that way. We just want freedom, right? We want freedom. And it seems like governments of different ilk are always struggling at best, if they even want to, and many of them don't. You know, that would be the bloodlusting, power-hungry thing, to be able to provide that for us. And it's why a lot of people could think the topic, like what we're talking about, is just like, you know, crazy stuff, not meant for the church, even radical politically. But I would suggest that is obviously very, very much not true. I mean, God's people, whether it's the Old Testament or the New, and at this rate we'll clearly be unpacking Galatians more next week, are called by God to be free and to live free. But that freedom isn't just like, you know, I'm stuck here in my closet and I have like just freedom in my head. I mean, how do we know like you're called to be free, like in the sense of like not having the government yoke and control you? Well, I don't know. Every Christian has something called like the Great Commission. Well, how can you get out in society and speak that truth, you know, if the Justice Department wants to come arrest you because you were praying on the street out in front of a abortion mill, right? That's kind of a problem, right? I mean, you know, how do you have freedom to share the gospel if doing so gets you arrested in the UK and arguably in America and Canada on a few instances? You follow? Like, this is the direction that we have been going down. It's not just crazy speculation. You could line up accounts, black hat, red. You could line up accounts from UK to Canada to America with real names and real places and real dates of this actually happening, right? So again, they wanted freedom. They wanted the government not to have a yoke of control over them. And the problem with communism is they want absolute control, which means they absolutely demolish religion. So there's just, you know, it's like the thing out of the scripture, you know, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? And the answer is nothing. It's like, what does Christianity have to do with communism? The answer is nothing.
There's such a, like a pattern from, even in our founding, about the misinterpretation of separation of church and state, when the whole point was that the church would have freedom and be protected from the overreach of the government. And that all got turned around. So to your point about how that progresses, it's then the pulpits are intimidated because of the tax burdens of the Johnson Amendment and so forth. And then people become used to that kind of thing. It's like the illustrations of the, you know, large elephant with a little rope around its foot, and it really can get away, but it's conditioned that it can't. And then it comes to the point where you said in the UK, not only standing in front of the abortion clinic, but getting arrested because you might have prayed in your mind.
Yeah, absolutely right. You know, the real question is, I say this with exaggeration to make an effect, but, you know, America had been known, especially in the 70s, 80s, and a little into the 90s, as like a country that was like, you know, maybe a little overly aggressive with our diplomacy sometimes from certain people's point of view for wanting to demand that our version of civil rights, quote unquote, be, followed fairly precisely in other countries, okay? In other words, we think you should do things exactly this way, and if you don't, that we'll financially or otherwise punish you. Should we do that to the UK? I'm just saying. Boy, that's a crazy idea. I exaggerate to make a point, but maybe I'm not exaggerating as much as I might think I am, right? I mean, should we go to the UK and go, we got a problem, right? You guys, we're going to have to vote against you in the UN, or whatever, because you guys have civil rights problems here. You're become tyrannical. You're throwing political prisoners in jail for them voicing their opinion on the internet. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that our State Department and sometimes CIA and others come after countries for doing. You see how weird things have gotten in what used to be called Christendom, the Western world, right? It also gives us caution. I mean, we will unpack this a lot more as we get to the very, very end of our study, and we only have a few sessions left. So I don't want to go too much further with it tonight with, again, always limited time. But we have to be careful of the bait of Satan. Got to be careful, okay? For folks that don't think that we were moving toward this path and have been moving toward this path in America, you're going to see something in the coming months. There have been people on one political side who have been terrorized. They've been put in jail. They have friends whose wives had miscarriages after the jackbooted thugs from the Justice Department burst into their house for nothing of any consequence relative to the actions of the government. And there are going to be people that want retribution in the form of what will be called justice. And the thing is, there's a line there somewhere from my point of view. We'll unpack this as we get later. We just have a few sessions left. There's a line. Should the rule of law be, in fact, applied, what does it say here in Leviticus, to everyone impartially? Yes. So if there are clear areas where people have just terribly violated the law, terribly abused government power, they should be held accountable for that, in my opinion, right? Because it has to stop, right? And it will never stop unless there's justice, which is accountability. However, the temptation that folks need to be very prayerful about for Christians and in praying for leaders regardless is not to cross the line into becoming like them, right? I mean, the folks who have won, I very, very much hope, do not do the same things in retribution. Justice is fine, and that justice may be labeled as retribution by those who have it applied to them. But there's a line somewhere. Justice, yes, we can never have this kind of stuff happen again. But retribution by becoming like them and following the same policies, no. Because once that gets loose in a country, I'd suggest to you that is the bait of Satan. You know what I mean? But the day's coming when we unpack that more. So Solomon has an incredibly keen intellect. He's brilliant. It was known around the world. Even people that weren't God followers came to him like, this guy is touched. He's got this wisdom, the ability to see and observe and all that. But if you know the story, he got sucked into the world. He got worldly thinking, and part of that came in no small part because he literally got in bed with pagans, with foreigners. I'm not trying to blast everyone who comes to America as a immigrant, because that'd be kind of ironic, since arguably all of us came somewhere down the family lines as immigrants. But what I'm saying is, just being truthful, you will find many repeated cautions about not getting intertangled and intertwined and intermarried with quote-unquote foreigners who are pagan in a way that will change your culture. This isn't for tonight, but I would also say that during that same period we talked about, the book didn't really do much with this at this point. In the 60s, there was something else that happened, interestingly, and that was radical change to our immigration policy. Radical change to our immigration policy. And the real world results are, if you look at today, it's no longer speculative, right? I mean, think about it. Let's just be real here about how people focus on the politics of these things. If you removed the nearly 1 million Polish people out of Pennsylvania, grew up with these folks, right? That's where I grew up. I was born in Wilmington, Delaware. Larry Santowski was like an uncle to me, lived next door. If you remove those nearly 1 million Polish descendants out of Pennsylvania, the outcome of that election is different in that state. It's just fact, right? It's just fact, all right? But if you move 500,000 Somalis into a district, that has a different outcome. Well, are we being racist here? One's lily white and one's probably not? Nope. What are we talking about? Polish guys historically are Christian. Somalis are not. Okay, that's relevant. What about freedom of religion and all, and not establishing a religion? I get it. If you look at the Polish people, their culture, their governmental relations and background, all the bad stuff that's happened to them and what they've done to strive and try to survive, practicing, what we think of as normative Western culture, economically, politically, democracy and all, that's a thing. Somalia is a war-torn hellhole, right? Now, again, there are lines. There are lines where it's like, do we want to, quote unquote, allow in good, decent people who are fleeing and want a better life in America? And will their countries and their backgrounds sometimes be war-torn and difficult? Yes. We're not here to draw the lines. We'll leave that to the politicians. But in light of our subject matter, just understand that there were broad rule changes where for our parents or grandparents, it was a bunch of like Polish people or Irish people. And they had certain backgrounds, socioeconomically, religiously, and whatever. And in our time, it's more likely to be Haitians or Somalis, the two most hellish war-torn places among a handful of others on earth. And it has an impact, right? And there are those that feel that, among other things, that these communist and aspirational communist types, you've already read it in the book earlier, have had a history of wanting to bring in people that are like this, not about skin tone. They want to bring in people that don't have connections to what was there before. They always want people that they can manipulate and politic. They don't want people who have deep roots. Those are their enemies. Do you follow? Remember at the very beginning of the book, they gave you some comments that were long before even communism, going back to Greco-Roman type times, about philosophers who talked about how tyrants like to bring in like outsiders, who didn't have strong ties in the community. It really isn't all that hard. I mean, it is elementary school, playground stuff. But we've been so enculturated now through, I believe, cultural Marxism, that it's almost like we feel like we're terrible, racist, unchristian, horrible people to allow ourselves to think in such practical, realistic, common sense ways. But the lack thereof has consequences, like all these girls getting raped, assaulted, and killed, et cetera, et cetera. It is quite bizarre. My son worked his butt off. He's an engineer, and he's going to move when his lease is up, because in his very high-priced townhomes, after they were building them all out, they started filling them with real sketchy Venezuelans. And it's real sketchy, right? These guys are, I've been there, and it's like, it doesn't make any sense. How can you have this really upscale, little enclave where the rent is high, and you're thinking everyone is going to be like hardworking, income-producing people, whether it's a plumber with his own business or like my kid who's an engineer. And it's like, but what about that chop shop they're working? It doesn't look like the movies. Do you get it? Like it's all upscale and brand new and beautiful and expensive, but why the Venezuelan chop shop? You know what I mean? Like, what is going on here? What I've been told is that these illegals come in, these criminal illegals, and they manipulate the system, and they use the government funds that are made available to them to basically pay rent in places like this. And so you could work really hard and work your way up to be a small business owner, or your kid could have worked hard to get a great job out of college, and you might be worried about something terrible happening to them in their wonderful neighborhood that they've worked their whole lives to be able to buy or whatever and get into, because they're surrounded by dudes that look like a bunch of gang members from Venezuela who were probably in prison a year ago. This is the kind of stuff that you've been reading about, right? Utah. Don't even get me going about Arizona. We had to move all our kids out of there, man. Within 4 years, Tucson changed. I'm just telling you, elections have results. Tucson went from, yeah, it's all right, right? Keep an eye on things, to, everybody get out. 4 years, that's all it took. And I mean, like, not just, boomer's scared, daddy's scared. No. It's like, how many times can you count all the death, all the shootings, the murders on campus? The media doesn't want to talk about. But you get the text because you're a parent and you're on the list.
A lot of the sanctuary cities in California are even in worse place. People can't live in San Francisco. There are other areas there as well that, because of what they have brought in as sanctuary cities, it's horrible.
Yeah, it is.
You can't even walk the streets.
And so what we'll close with here is, look, I'm glad that we're meeting tonight and it's after the election, because people are like, man, if you're saying all that, you're angling for one candidate. Well, it's kind of moot now. Election's over, right? If there's any time that anything you say is going to have less impact on anybody voting, it's today, okay? Because the next election is a long way off, and nobody's going to be thinking about any of the dynamics that are going on today, 4 years minus a day from now. But why am I telling you this? Because, as was mentioned before, different people have been pushing at this, and I'll leave it at this and we'll close out. Whether you think of it as just pure evil, as if the two things I'm about to say are necessarily different, and they're not necessarily different. Whether you think about the kind of stuff we're talking about as just pure evil, right? Evil in the human heart, people who have bloodlust, gang members, all this, and they're just looking for new territory, new people to ravage, like robber barons of old and societal breakdown periods of old. Or whether you think, now this is a little more organized, like there's a bigger picture here. It's the stuff we've been reading. There are people that want to bring chaos. They want to tear things down because it creates a fertile field for potential communist revolution. Whether you think it's one side or the other or somewhere in between, I think it's exceedingly hard to argue that right now we're not seeing the fruit of this, and it's rotten fruit throughout our country. It's extremely real. Right here in our neighborhood, all this. And that's why we had to talk also about the corruption of what otherwise seemed like good civil rights things in the 50s and a little into the 60s. Because one of the reasons you may not have top of mind awareness about these things we're closing out with, the incredible danger of the folks who have come in illegally, who are gang members, prisoners, etc., is because we're coming full circle to the end. People have been enculturated with this sort of Maoist cultural Marxism, where you're not allowed to see. It's like being in Russia again. You're not allowed to see certain things. You're not allowed to say certain things. And so it's amazing to me. You can have people right here in our immediate community that are killed by illegals. Sometimes people who are beloved, longtime staff members, I don't know, like in local TV stations. And they still won't tell you the truth. Like their beloved friend who worked with them for 25 years, at the TV station gets killed by some illegal, but they will cover it and not let you know. That's how this warped enculturation plays out. And you know what it sounds like to me? Communism. Because they're always about controlling narratives. They're always about propaganda because that's all they got. They're obsessed with it. Like no other form of government, they're obsessed with it. And that's again, something I think we're impacted by. I'm just telling you, people are dying all the time in our country, including in our immediate area, by people who should not be in our country, and you're not told about it. It is covered. You have to dig and dig and dig to find the truth of it, right? That, by the way, is not democracy, right? Without a freedom without freedom of speech and free flow of information, you don't have a real democracy. You have some sort of controlled, corrupted democracy. You see how that goes together? So one last time, democratic republic, constitutional republic, freedom of speech, free flow of information, informed citizens, hopefully, can make votes and determination. The absolute opposite, communistic, top-down, no one is told anything, complete control of info, will throw you in jail for wrong think, yet alone wrong speak. Those are the two sort of extremes, or not extremes, those are the two pillars, if you will, that you might ponder as you look around our own country, yet alone the world. Let's close out. Lord God, we thank you again for having this opportunity to come here openly at your feet in your house. God, as we have referenced your word especially, may you draw us into it. God, may your Holy Spirit come and teach us as we make our own observations, have our own questions, things that we agree or disagree with. May we humbly, Lord, come to you and prayerfully ask that you give us guidance and wisdom. May we not make the mistake of Solomon. In Jesus' name, amen. We'll pick back up and finish off some of the pieces and parts and move into some other areas next week. I only ask that you finish what had already been assigned. Just finish through page 180 as we move to our next section. We'll largely be concentrating on 157 to about 180 next week, right? And then we'll keep moving along and we'll be on schedule to complete our sessions on time. God bless you.